Welcome to the Psychedelic Mom podcast. I'm your host, Michaela Carlin, and I'm here today with Jen Whaley. How are you doing?
Good, Michaela. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, it's so exciting to have another psychedelic mom here. You have a new 18-month-old that we hear in the background. Is
That's
that
him.
yes?
Right on cue.
Boy or a
He's a
girl?
boy. His name is Jonah.
How has it been going?
It's a journey. It's a wild ride, going with the flow, riding the waves, learning much every day. Trying to keep that mindset of allowing him to be the teacher.
Yeah. Oh, God, that's an amazing philosophy. So, Jen, you're a physician's assistant and a certified psychedelic assisted therapist, a medicine woman serving MDMA and psilocybin, but you have some news about this new adventure that you're on, which is with ketamine. So I'd love to hear about that. And a yoga instructor and a breath facilitator. And it seems like what you're really doing is deep healing work. And you graduated in 2011 from the University of Detroit Mercy with a bachelor's in science and biology. And you went on, you were just telling me, to get your psychedelic certification. Where was that from?
That was at the California Institute of Integral Studies in 2019.
So you started in kind of this Western model of health and then went more alternative health. So let's start kind of with what brought you on this alternative health path, and then we'll discuss like how earth medicines and psychedelics came into that, and then maybe how motherhood and psychedelics, kind of these journeys parallel each other as these initiations. So how did you switch gears from like Western model to alternative health?
Yeah. Beautiful. So I, like many of us listening, I imagine, American born, American raised, very kind of Western paradigm, Western mindset. I went to school, undergraduate, grad school, PA school, just all in this very Western medical mindset. I worked when I graduated in emergency medicine and also women's healthcare, and was just kind of doing the prescribed thing, what we're supposed to do, with never questioning what it was I had learned. And it was actually not my professional journey, but my own personal life that a little earlier, but more around like 2017, really had me questioning the things that I had been told and had known. I, at the time, was struggling in a relationship with codependency. My partner was struggling with addiction. And in our own personal lives and also in the relationship itself, all of the doors that we were looking through our which we didn't realize at the time, like blindered lenses, weren't helping, right? So it was at that point when I started recognizing, like, there's got to be another way. And that was when I actually went back to become a yoga instructor then. I did my first yoga teacher training in 2017. In that 30-day immersive course, there are no coincidences. I came upon shamanic breath work.
Right.
I was introduced to plant medicine. And around that same time, I started studying A Course in Miracles, all of which have just completely shifted my paradigm, the way that I look at and define the world. And really just...
Yeah, how could it not? Oh my gosh. Yeah, let's just pause right there. So because I'm a big fan of the Course in Miracles. What an incredible teaching.
Yes, me too.
What a dense book with like rich teachings. So before that, where were you kind of aligned in your life spiritually, and what were some of like your conditioned thinking that were suddenly blasted open in this 30-day experience?
Yeah, I think the most tangible shift in like the mentality around this was the idea of like diagnosing things pathologically. So my mindset would have said, like, if something's wrong in our day-to-day life, it's because there's something wrong with us, right? It's addiction. It's that we have a problem that can be defined and pathologized by this Western definition, and therefore we need to treat it with, whether that's medication or traditional therapy or whatever it is, something coming from the outside that essentially came from whether it was outright said or not, the idea that there's something wrong with us, though, right? And I didn't learn yet at that point that a lot of these what I'm calling now like coping mechanisms or very normal responses and reactions to what might be a very difficult external situation that is put upon us by, yes, our relationships, but also just our bigger culture at large. This like productivity based, always going, always achieving, always succeeding, always needing to make so much money, always needing to prove ourselves. This very kind of hyper masculinized, high stress environment where many of us are not feeling healthy within it, that maybe the problem's not with us, but we're actually coping appropriately and can look at things differently in order to, yes, heal what we've been challenged with, but also start looking at these other pieces that say, hey, there's nothing wrong with you, but you can live your life in a much more healthy way that doesn't require like treatment or medicine that you're taking every day, just recognizing you need a shift in perspective, which is what A Course in Miracles invites us into, right? That miracle of, I have a coach who always says, everything changes, but nothing changes. So it's all a lot about empowering ourselves to shift the way that we look at and define the world that causes or allows us more comfortability, more ease, less suffering. Taking kind of that power back and stop outsourcing it to our physicians or our partners or whoever it is that we've been handing it to.
So what happened with that partnership? Did that kind of evolve with you or did that fall away?
So interestingly enough, this will lead us very smoothly into talking about psychedelics. So after a couple of years of kind of trying every avenue and every doorway, we found ayahuasca. And it was introduced actually in my yoga teacher training. The first time that I sat with the medicine by myself, I didn't actually have a very large experience. So I'm not going to touch on that very deeply. But my second ceremony, I went with that partner and also his father. And it was so interesting because look.
Wow. Wait, what?
Well, I can look back at it now and I can say, like, we were going to help him. My intention, right, was to, like, help my partner through his addiction. Like, really, like, I'm the helper and you have the problem and we're going to go together and I'm just supporting
I'm going to help you fix it.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think it's probably needless to say, but I'll go ahead and say it anyway. I mean, it completely just blew me open. I was shown every single place that I was handing him the keys and responsibility to my own happiness. I finally recognized what is codependency and why am I suffering so intensely in this relationship when it's not his fault. And just, no, we did not continue the partnership. And I think that was a big lesson in surrender.
Yeah, I just want to stop there for 1 second because I think codependency is so common for women and obviously men too. But I think just in the structure of society, even more so for women. Were you even aware of what codependency was at the time before ayahuasca?
Not at the time. No.
And what would you say, like for someone who's listening that is like, what's codependency? What are some ways that would help someone identify that maybe the pain or the relational dynamic that they're in is due to a codependent pattern?
The best way, and this is like you said, it's kind of a tricky subject. There's a lot of different definitions for it because it's not necessarily definable by one tangible thing. So the best way that I can come to define it, and I define it with myself and I define it with clients, is whenever you catch your happiness depending on anyone or anything outside of yourself, you have a codependent relationship with that person or thing. So in my case, it was my partner's sobriety. And this isn't a huge psychological mystery. I grew up with, an alcoholic parent in my house. And this is kind of a pattern that I then carried into my adult relationships. But I was noticing that if he was doing well, I was doing well, right? And if he was suffering, I was suffering. And so my sense of well-being, my sense of ability to calmly and peacefully and with any type of confidence to navigate the world was 100%, I'm just going to say that, like dependent on him.
I think what you're talking about is really riding the emotional roller coaster of someone else's ride. It's like you're on the roller coaster. on the ride of someone else's ups and downs, and then your system is mirroring
Very
that.
much so. And I think
Yeah.
it's also, saying it like that is beautiful because it's a superpower that we can be this aware of and this connected to a human. And this is what allows us to have really beautiful, intimate relationships. But when we have no concept of setting boundaries, recognizing that we don't have to carry somebody else's pain, also, that we can empathize with someone, we can have compassion for them, but we don't have to suffer because their suffering is huge. So it's, coming out of codependency is a long recovery process. And I think a lot of it is just learning what's ours and what belongs to other people, and noticing how often we're carrying that which belongs to somebody else, taking responsibility for that which belongs to somebody else, and learning where it is we can empower ourselves by really taking responsibility for what's ours and empowering people on the other side of that relationship to take care of their own stuff too. There's something in that I'm going to fix you mentality that's very disempowering to the other person, because what we're unconsciously telling them is that we don't think they can handle it themselves. We're actually keeping them in a paradigm of disempowerment because we think that we know better or can do better or understand better or have a better plan. And we're taking that over and never giving them the chance to step into their own power. So we're taking it from them and us simultaneously.
It's almost like this energetics that is happening, almost unconscious, nonverbal energetics that are happening of like, let me fix you. And you're right, it robs the person of the feeling that they have their own agency and they may have to go through their own suffering and take responsibility for their own suffering. But it's almost like this energetic exchange that's going on that's like not even verbalized. And then when one person, as you said, like suddenly you became aware of all the places that you were handing your power over of your happiness. Talk about freedom. Talk about another psychedelic thing, right? Coming out of just understanding what codependency is and changing relational patterns. That is an incredible soul-revealing process.
Very much so. And I want to just pop in a note here too, that when you said like freeing, yes, on one hand, but also very challenging because, and this will tie in really nicely to like motherhood, is I think especially with women, and maybe this is why you see it more with women, how you mentioned, our culture almost glorifies it. The person that can suppress their own needs so much so and care for everybody else, that kind of martyr, sacrificial, selfless person is kind of glorified. And so when I found out, when I had the realization that my attempt to what I was then defining as love, my partner, how I knew how, this very like sacrificial, fixing love was actually harming him, it wasn't necessarily immediate freedom. I had a big grieving process to recognize that what I thought was love was actually holding him back from his own power. And that was really hard pill for me to swallow. So I think there's something in
that is too, because it's what you're talking about too is it's like, yeah, it's not this magical wand that's like, oh, I have codependent patterns, I'm just going to stop that and free you. And now I feel free. It's like an entire underworld process of looking at what did I learn about love?
Right.
And if I learned codependent love as a child, whoa, where did I feel loved? It's not a simple process of coming out of codependency.
No. Like you said, an underworld process. We deal with a lot of like guilt when we start learning to set boundaries. We start recognizing how we victimize ourselves to situations, and also what we're taking from giving our love, It's like that need to be
and terror,
helpful.
I would say, like fear. Wouldn't you say fear too? Like, because there's that feeling of, oh my gosh, if this is what I've known as love, this kind of attachment style, what happens when I change? Now I'm going to be disconnected from love.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep. It's the only way we've ever defined it. When it's taken away or when we start to shift away from it, we're kind of in that womb space, that empty void of like, I know what's not true any longer for me. And I don't yet know where I'm going, at least not in an embodied way that I can trust into in this moment. So yeah, there's definitely this empty space of transition where we have to lean into trust and surrender and the process of unfolding before we can step out on the other side with confidence, having learned that there is another way.
So what did earth medicines teach you about that? And what medicine would you say, would you have a journey or maybe a compilation of your journeys that really showed you this new path, what love is? You know, when you're reading the book of Return to Love or The Course in Miracles, you're reading it. But then there's something about having the visceral response in an earth medicine experience of almost infused wisdom into the cells. Did you have an experience like that made you kind of be able to trust more deeply?
Definitely. And it was in that same ceremony that we've already touched on that, I think I told you when we talked about this interview that I define my life currently as before and after this one particular ceremony. And this was the ceremony that I realized what surrender is. And just like you said with love, it's like we have this concept. I think everybody has an idea of what the word surrender means. And it's a concept in their mind and they think they get it. And then there becomes this moment where you really have to set down any illusion you ever had about control and really just surrender to a greater, higher process and see what happens. Like there's no knowing until you do it. And that's kind of like this catch-22. So in that ceremony with ayahuasca, I had prepared, right? I had watched all the videos and read all the information, and I knew the concept of you should surrender and trust the medicine and find the breath and all of those really cute sentences that people say to you when you're preparing for ayahuasca, right?
all these little memes.
Yeah, thanks, guys. And then I watched myself. I mean, it was a 7-hour fight. And I watched myself try to get out of it in every single way I possibly could. I tried to tell her I had already learned the lesson and she could set me down now. I got it, right? I hear you. I tried to hide from her. I tried to run from her. I tried to negotiate that I'd come back later. I tried, like, literally, I watched my mind, and this is what I had been doing in my relationship. Try a psychiatrist, try a therapist, try this, do this, do this. Don't let go. Like, try everything. And so I had to go through that in that ceremony, too. Like, try every single thing. Because only then, only when I had really exhausted every single other potential possibility would I turn to surrender. And that ceremony and that to me, it was like, this is it. I'm never going to come out of this. My body doesn't matter. My name doesn't exist. I'm going to be that person people hear about that never came out of their ayahuasca ceremony and went crazy. And I had to just surrender to that. I said, fuck it. And I literally thought I was dying.
Right.
Like I just gave up any attachment I had to me, Jen Whaley, walking away from that ceremony as Jen Whaley. I, for all my own mind purposes, died on that mat that day. And the second that I did that, right, what happens? Absolute bliss. And that's what leads us into what you were just saying. How did you learn about love? Like, love is always there, just waiting to catch you, waiting to hold you. It is your own mind games trying to control, manipulate, change, shift, whatever it is you're trying to do that are holding you out of this empty space behind it all, just waiting for you to fall into it and to feel blissfully taken care of, held, trusting, like a baby laying in its mother's arms, the kind of situation that most of us in our life don't have that opportunity because we didn't have that type of relationship with our mothers, but to be absolutely surrendered and know that we are held, that every single need we could possibly have is already taken care of, and that we don't have to understand it. You know, I come from a very intellectual mindset, and sometimes I think that gets in the way, like the need to understand. And I constantly remind myself and my clients, like, the part can't understand the whole. The microcosm cannot understand the macrocosm by definition. And the more we try, the more we are getting in our own fucking way of just being in absolute bliss all the time.
You know, and again, you can talk about these death moments, but it's also a birth moment. There you were dying to self and totally birthing this new expansive person. It's wild. So then what happened?
Well, then it was the beginning, I think, and actually I'm glad that you asked it so bluntly that way, because I think a lot of us have this illusion that you have this big experience. And even now, as psychedelics are becoming more popularized in our culture, people think it's a panacea. We're going to take this medicine and we're going to be fixed.
Totally.
It's like, nope, because then there's the integration. And I'm still integrating this ceremony, 7 years later now, It's how do you move forward from that, knowing what you now know, and embodying it.
Right.
And it doesn't happen overnight. I'm not saying that it can't. For those of you listening, I've seen that happen too. But I think more often it's about regrooving, right? It's noticing our patterns so that we then have a choice about it. We still have to make that choice every day. We still have to work on our new neurological patterns, choose to leave behind the old ones, because if we fall asleep for a moment, it's very easy to fall back into those old patterns. So that awareness that it gives us needs to be cultivated and practiced daily, moment to moment, breath to breath. And that's what helps you change moving forward.
So you were just really talking about something that I totally believe as well, just in this psychedelic renaissance or psychedelic reemergence, whatever you want to call it. There's a lot of messaging that I don't think is really helpful, actually can be really harmful for people that think they're going to go take this magic pill and wake up, because it can be radically altering to your personal narratives that you've always had, which is incredibly beautiful, but can be incredibly challenging. And then I think the other piece that you were just talking about, because we have all these different parts within us, you may now have this new awakened being part, but you still have the child parts that might be afraid of that change and viscerally are feeling like I still want to have the brakes on in my life. And the rewiring of that child, and kind of the unbinding of many belief structures that come from our families, our culture, and our relational patterns. Yeah. That's a really good point.
Yeah, 100%. And I mean, the word integration, which I think is thrown around a lot and misunderstood a lot, again, as the psychedelic renaissance is happening and these words are becoming more mainstream, but it stems from the word integer, this becoming oneness, right? This singularity of all of these parts coming together. So like you said, it's not that you never feel fear of your inner child again, because she's still there. You just get to bring her in and be the mother to her that you always needed. And then she doesn't make your choices. It's like when we recognize where we've been hostage, essentially, to these parts of ourselves, where they just take control because they're so embodied in a particular moment that triggers us into fear. They're making our choices. And we don't have to shun them or push them away or, fear them even. We can invite them in, but we just comfort them and then make a choice from a different place. The analogy that I always like is it's from Bill Richards, who's one of the main psychedelic researchers of our time. He talks about a ski hill. It's like you've been sledding down a ski hill over and over and over every single day for decades, lifetimes maybe, and this one path is just so worn. The rut is so deep in that spot that if you aren't thinking about it, you just automatically go down. You take a psychedelic, you have a psychedelic journey. It's like you're standing at the top of the hill and somebody shakes the snow globe and you have this fresh coat of powder all over the entire hill. And all of a sudden you're standing there and you realize oh my God, I have choices. And that doesn't mean that you won't go back to your old choice, because that's easy and that's remembered and that's in your body and that's how default, right? But it also means you have this, what I call the sacred pause, where you're standing at the top of the hill every time and you can choose a new path. And if you fall asleep for a minute, you'll probably end up in your old path. So this takes a lot of gentleness and self-compassion and self-forgiveness and a sense of humor, but to come back in every moment and say, okay, I'm going to choose something new. And eventually, truly, and this takes time, right? Eventually, that new path becomes the new default, and we forget. We look back in 10 years and kind of chuckle about the way we used to do things or the way we used to see things and how it's not even existent anymore.
That's one of my favorite analogies as well with psychedelics. And what I love too is the grooves are almost hard to get out of. Honestly, when the snow is so packed, it's you have to stay in those grooves. And then it's a new layer of being has been put down and you're just oh, there's choices here. It's pretty wild. I would say the only experience that I've had that was different than that with psychedelics still took some integrative process was I did notice after iboga, certain patterns like fell away. It's like I couldn't anymore. It was like, wait, even if I wanted to try to do the thing that I always did, it was like, it just didn't happen. So strange.
That is very interesting. And I have not had personal experience with Iboga.
Yeah.
I know many people who have, but I'm really intrigued in that. What a blessing.
Yeah, at the time it was more confusing.
Sure.
And like you said, I'll integrate that one for a long time. So then you held space for others. And what was the kind of desire after your own experience to then support others in this process?
To me, that was less of a personal choice and more of just feeling like the Course in Miracles would say, Spirit moves through me as me, that this was a divine calling obligation. You know, I know that probably sounds a little silly to other people, but I just recognized like there are so many people with the mindset that I have that I could support in having this shift. And I had all the resources to do it. So I was a physician assistant at the time, like you said. I read Michael Pollan's book, which is pretty popular, that How to Change Your Mind. And in the book itself, I read about the program at the California Institute of Integral Studies. And that was the first time I heard of it. I like dog-eared the page. I remember just like, that's interesting. Finished the book. Like later went back and was like, what is this? And I was thinking like, at that point, I was doubting being a PA. I was like, should I let go of my license? I can't belong in this culture anymore. Like, got to get out of here. And then I read one of the requirements was to already have like a medical license of some sort. And I'm like, okay, this is why I'm a PA, because I had to be here.
It's just magic.
I had to be here. I have to have this behind me so that I can then evolve into this. So went back. That year-long program was amazing. Since then have been supporting other people. And I had already been doing a little bit of what I call psycho-spiritual coaching, working with the Course in Miracles, yoga, and then started weaving psychedelics into that space as well, supporting other clients, other people on the journey, into...
It's such profound work, isn't it? I mean, I had a similar path in the sense that like I never thought this would be what I'd be doing with my life.
Yeah, you couldn't make it
and
up.
And that earmark of the page... The earmark of the page was like a vacuum that just, kind of like grips you. Like, wait, where am I going? What am I doing? What? Never stood a chance against that. But going into the deeps with people, what's that like for you?
First of all, and this is going to sound paradoxical to people who, I'll just invite the paradox to be held, I'll say it that way. But while I am a massive advocate for the use of psychedelics, they have completely changed my life, and I've seen them completely change other people's for the better. Beautiful. And no one ever needs them, right? I always say that the last message, the last lesson you're ever going to get from any medicine, modality, practice, anything, is that you never needed it in the first place. Yeah. They point us home. Yes. They turn our senses back towards our own heart, but they don't give us anything we can't access anyway. I work with holotropic inspired breathwork, or shamanic breathwork, transformational breathwork, people call it, but it's an intense breathing technique, shifted the mind into a very similar to psychedelic-like state. And people are just blown away by it. And they say, why do we need psychedelics? And I say, we don't. This is one of many paths. There is no right answer. They're tools that we can use when and if they feel appropriate for us. And so even with clients, if people come to me and I tend to believe if we're having the conversation, then they've been called. But yeah, like following their own heart. If people are interested and feeling called, and I, even in my coaching is guiding people in, what does your intuition tell you? Because I fully believe that these medicines, mushrooms, ayahuasca, like they have a spirit.
They call you.
They're communicating with you. And maybe that communication is a no with a judgment or a fear or whatever it is, but we trust even that. If I would have had this experience on ayahuasca 2 years before I did, I would never have been able to handle it. So it's like, it's not always for everybody. It happens when it's meant to happen. And I always teach people to trust their own heart when choosing what medicine, when choosing when, to really listen to that and not to listen to anyone outside.
When you're ready, the medicine will show up. And I remember feeling ready 2 years prior to actually finding a medicine woman that I felt comfortable with. And I say the same thing all the time, like just, it's because really what the medicine, as you said, is teaching us to do is follow our own intuition. So the more someone can follow their intuition on who's the medicine person, what is the medicine, that is the medicine right there.
Yeah. That's what I say. The moment you whisper the word psilocybin, you're already in it. Like everything that comes up from then on is the medicine.
Right? It's kind of bizarre because I'll say that to clients, like, and I think they think like, oh, right. I'll say when you've committed, the medicine starts working. And it's a throwaway line, I think, to them. And then suddenly they'll come back for a call and be like, oh my God. And I'm like, I know.
Yep. Yep. Been there. I feel it. Totally. Totally.
So what would you say, because I've done a lot of episodes on mushrooms, but not many on MDMA. And so what would you say as far as serving somebody MDMA and the difference between mushrooms and MDMA as far as the experiences? And I don't know, do you serve them both together as well?
I don't serve them together, though I have heard of people doing that and have had really beautiful experiences. The mechanism of action of MDMA, it has two things that it does. So the classic psychedelics like DMT, which is ayahuasca, which is 5-MeO, which is psilocybin, which is mescaline, they have this very psychedelic effect. There's an additional mechanism of action with MDMA, which is a downregulation of the amygdala, which is the fear center of the brain, and it also has that classical psychedelic effect. So it gives that same or similar access to the unconscious material, while at the same time, physiologically in your brain, it's down-regulating your fear response. So a lot of people, I'm one of these people, when I go into psilocybin or when I go into ayahuasca, I have this period of time I have to get through where I'm like terrified and I'm working with my own fear until I can kind of drop in. With MDMA, people typically don't have that same response. So I find it particularly beautiful, and there's good research on this too, with people with PTSD, histories of like war violence and sexual trauma, and people who have had like really big violent traumas in their past, which enables them to go back to those places without the body like kicking into that fight or flight fear response, because it's actually downregulated physiologically. So it enables them to really look at those things from a more neutral standpoint, to look at it through a different lens and perspective, to kind of revisit without that clenching fear that people feel even in traditional talk therapy when they're in a safe space, because it's biological, right?
Yeah, I think it's such a beautiful way to it's like a gentle entry into the subconscious with also deep compassion and self-love for oneself. It's really beautiful.
Yeah. And it's not, I don't like to necessarily say it's a fun one or anything like that. Like it can be intense and it can be deep, and you can go into places that are challenging and scary, etc. But yeah, there's something just about it holding you in a calmer state. People with PTSD, and again, I hate to even use these diagnoses, right? Because it's not pathological, but people with trauma in their history have a difficulty trusting. And that's a part of what is challenging for them. And so it also helps them establish trust with their facilitator or their guide or their therapist that they're working with, where you can eventually build that trust, but it might take a long period of time. It's a catalyst in establishing that bond of trust, which, as you know, I'm sure, is a huge part of the medicine. Feeling like you're connected to somebody that has your best interest in mind, that you don't always have to have your guard up, you don't always have to have your protectors out first. And that alone is therapeutic for people who are always living in their sympathetic nervous system.
Yeah, I think some people will say after MDMA, it was like the most relaxed their body had ever felt, or the most self-love that they had ever felt. And I think sometimes I look at mushrooms and I think, wow, if you really want to move repressed emotion and repressed energetics in the body, Mushrooms are incredible decomposers for that. I think MDMA just is like a different way of getting maybe to the same stuff. And it's a little bit of a disassociative. So they're both incredibly healing, but healing in very different ways.
Yeah. And I'll just mention with my own history with all of these medicines too, I had a lot of resistance initially to both MDMA and ketamine. I had this had come in the door through indigenous plant medicine. I thought it had to be, come from the earth and be natural and had to look like this ceremony and, very kind of structured in my mind. And I had a lot of resistance to these, first of all, like synthetic, right? Like man-made by our society, these medicines. I will just say the first time both of my experiences with both MDMA and ketamine, I was completely blown away and recognized that they have massive potential and a space in this conversation, certainly. And then the other thing I realized...
I was the same way.
And one other thing I want to mention, because you mentioned before about just like this access to self-love that people, or love for anything that people don't typically have. It ties back to a question that you asked a little while ago about like going into the depths with people. And I personally have this mindset that I often work through where I think like it has to be hard. It has to be dirty. It has to be this like drudging through the mud.
That's why I was
the
just
dark night
you.
of the soul. And if it's not like, it's not going to heal you.
then it's not going to be.
And then,
it's funny because, I don't know if you work with somebody else, but my colleague and I have had that at times where it's like, I don't know, I want them to go in deep. And it's like, well, who is this for?
Totally.
Is it for us? Is it for them? You have to begin to step back, get out of the way.
Absolutely.
I like this phrase, like sitting behind yourself almost, and allowing the space. But I think you're right. It's like, if it's not the dark night of the soul and all the parts weeping, it's not healing. But
well, the other thing I realized is this too, like we have so, we're infinite people on this planet. Everybody's experience is really different. So if there's something that I'm working through that I prefer to make it dark and dirty and drudge through this, like, okay. But if there is somebody who's living their life and every single day is that dark night of the soul, they are suicidal. They're on the verge of hurting themselves every day. They have serious traumas that are coming to light. They hate themselves. They don't need to suffer more. Right. Sometimes, like you said, like
bring in the love.
Like taking a deep breath of relaxation and relief and feeling what love feels like in your body, like that is the medicine. That's where we're all going anyway. Like,
totally. It's so interesting. This is a good segue because the other day I was thinking of kind of like a women's retreat for catered, groups of friends or mother-daughter type of thing, where it's massage, sound bowl, MDMA, but it is like a pure self-love container where it's like just about treating ourselves. Because as you said, we are celebrated for being martyrs. We're celebrated for like, if it's self-care, well, then it's really like make sure you have six-pack abs and you're looking good for the standards of the beauty. When do we actually stop and just for ourselves find a space to be truly like receive love, receive gentleness, receive self-care? So as a medicine woman and a mother, how would you say that motherhood is like a psychedelic?
So motherhood is the most potent teacher I've experienced thus far. I always explain psychedelics to people that they're like magnifiers. So anything that's already present, it'll bring your attention to, it'll bring it to surface, it'll bring it to light, it'll allow your awareness of it. Again, it's not teaching us or showing us anything that's not there. So I feel very similar with motherhood. And this, even before, you can define where motherhood starts in any way, but pregnancy. Like all through this, an absolute magnifier on every single part of our lives, our relationships, our ways that we communicate, our ability or inability to set boundaries, our willingness to dive into self-care or to slow down when we need it. It just brings to life all of these pieces that we are then welcome and able to look at. And that continues on through, so far, the first 18 months, and I'm sure forever, right? It's like they're magnifiers. They're bringing everything to the surface for us to look at. I literally had a vision when I was pregnant of my baby like nestling down into my womb. And it was as if, as he was like embedding himself in his cozy little nook, he was finding things that were like uncomfortable for him to lay there. And they were like these deep-seated beliefs that I had stored in my womb. And I pictured them in envelopes. And he was literally handing the envelopes up into my mind from my womb and saying like, this can't stay here. This can't stay here. This can't stay here.
Whoa. This doesn't serve us.
Like clearing the space for him to have the openness that he needed in order to come into earth and then to live his life. Beliefs about, say, like my unworthiness to be a mother, my unworthiness to deserve this innocent love, my belief that I could like do it wrong or mess up, you know, like these self kind of condemning beliefs that I carried. That had to go before he could come. And it was just so interesting. It was as if, and I believe this, like spirit
Did
babies.
you have a ceremony around that? Like, did you have some particular kind of ceremony around letting go of these beliefs, whether it was a fire ceremony or some kind of marking of this letting go?
That's exactly what I did. I had this little bowl. I'm in the room now, actually. I had this like back room in my house, and it's like I made a little altar, and I had a little bowl, and I would just keep track. And it wasn't like a one-time thing, but like whenever those things came to the surface, I would write them down, and then I take them back, and I would burn them. And it's interesting because, again, like that symbolic burning of, we like to think, okay, it's gone, right? But like, no, that's the beginning of the awareness. And so like they would continue to arise and continue to arise.
Right.
And they came back in the birth, right? The birth, again, another magnifier of what you don't look at, what you don't fully energetically release in pregnancy shows up in the birth. What you're still carrying after the birth shows up in shows up in postpartum and then early motherhood. And we just keep being given the opportunity to set these things down or shift them or change them or redefine them or somehow love them, you know, integrate them into our wholeness rather than judging them. There's been so many ways that this little guru has just blasted open my own beliefs about myself, really.
A lot of self-love.
Eventually, yeah. But and you find that, and this is the Course in Miracles, right?
Highlights,
it shows you what's in the
magnifies.
way. It shows you where you're not loving yourself.
It shows you what's in the way.
Course in Miracles says, removing the barriers to the remembrance of love's presence. So yes, love has always been there, but I put all this bullshit on top of it.
That's really the path, isn't it?
Yeah. And it's just clearing the way again.
Dropping the veils.
To remember what's already always been there. But yeah, definitely. I mean, motherhood has empowered me in ways I had never imagined, and challenged me in ways that I had never imagined simultaneously. And I guess that's the way it always goes, right?
So do you have a practice? So let's say something happens and you're noticing kind of that wounded part arise that feels unworthy of love or unworthy, or maybe, I'm doing it wrong. Those conditioned beliefs. Do you have a practice of how you hold yourself in that space?
I have many. I wouldn't say I have like a go-to ritual, which I probably should. Now that you're asking, I'm like, I should have this like ready to go. But I use many tools. So meditation is a big one. And I think awareness is just the biggest one of all. We talked a little bit earlier about like our inner child. And I think, again, like there's something in me, and I'll just speak for myself, that when these wounded parts come up, I feel shame around them, like they shouldn't be here. I thought I healed that wound already, or why is this taking so long, or why is this still coming up? And I start to get down on myself about that. So teaching myself to mother those parts of myself, whereas like if my child came to me and said like, I'm scared, I wouldn't say like, you shouldn't feel scared, get the hell out of here. I'd say like, I love you, right? You're safe. So it's really about catching myself, and I would kind of like layer it, right? Like catching the fear here at the level of fear and accepting and loving it versus catching it later when I'm like, angry that I'm afraid, guilty that I'm afraid, already fought with my partner because I'm afraid. It's like, I'm 9 layers deep before I finally realize what happened. And if I would have just embraced the fear at the beginning and comforted myself.
Right.
So really like that awareness, early awareness is the practice for me. And then choosing to respond to it differently instead of react out of these old patterns.
So beautiful, isn't it? This process.
It's wild.
What would you say this little guru has taught you?
Well, the first word that came to my mind when you said that is surrender, right? And that's an over and over process about letting go of the things that are out of our control. And it sounds silly, but it's little things that come up in the mundane day to day that can really teach you things that can change your internal sense of safety, love, well-being, like massively. So like when I say like surrender to what you can't control, it's as simple as like being okay with the house being a disaster at times and not judging myself for that, right? It's like you can't control it all. And it always was an illusion that we could. How we stress ourselves out about everything needing to be a certain way. And then along comes an 18-monther rolling around, just a bundle of love and joy and saying like, it's okay, mom. Like, it's okay, like it's okay to let yourself play, surrender. So these are like other themes, like play, right? He's teaching me again to play. And this is another part of like reconnecting to my inner child of like, tapping into creativity, pieces of myself that I left behind in order to be productive, like getting out crayons and scribbling all over and not worrying about what it looks like or judging it and all of these simple things that again just have like translation to massive storylines that we carry about ourselves. And it's really beautiful. He's very much shifting my relationship with my partner, his father, as well as my relationship with my extended family. So like my mother, my sister. I historically have been like much of a people pleaser and very like wanting everyone to like me and worrying about other people's perceptions of me. And having like another human being that I feel responsible for his well-being at this time really has given me at times the courage to like vocalize disagreement with other people that I may have let slide in the past when it was just me. So he's really been, and this is tough, right? Like this is the border of where I am and where I'm going. This is the edge of the comfort zone, but learning to
it's that fertile edge of growth.
Yeah.
Which is like, it's like one of the things I think motherhood teaches you in psychedelics is like, are you choosing a life that is growth inducing or growth inhibiting? And if you're choosing a life that's growth inducing, that fertile edge is always there. That fertile edge of comfort and discomfort. If you're playing like I want to continue to grow and drop the barriers of love, that fertile edge is there's layers and layers of that.
Yeah. And it's like it doesn't get easier necessarily, but we just get more comfortable being uncomfortable on those edges. Like we start to live there and trust, and this is the surrender, like trust that if we do something differently, even though we don't know where it's going to take us, like we've always been caught before and we're going to keep learning and we're going to keep shifting into, I talk about like finding out what's on the other side of fear. So if I'm fearful to like take a stand that might piss somebody else off and set a boundary where before I would have just swallowed it because it's just me. But now that I have this little guy I got to look out for, like I'm going to vocalize it, even though everything in my body is telling me don't do that. The person's going to react. You're going to be at fault. You're going to feel guilty. Like all of these things coming up. Doing it anyway, right? Because again, noticing these parts of me that want everyone to love me, that want to people please, that want to tiptoe, and saying like, hey, I see you. I validate what you had to do to protect me at a certain point in my life, and thank you for that. And you're not going to make the decision today because you're safe and you don't have to. You're free.
Right.
But then like stepping into that.
Yeah.
And then, like learning that that's okay. Right. And you start to realize like, as you do that more and more with more confidence and start to embody it, sure, things around you shift. Sometimes people get upset, but more often than not, like people meet you where you're at and understand. And I find oftentimes it's like way worse in my head than it actually is once I like spill it out into the world.
Well, it's kind of probably the old physiology is still alive, charged, because that fear is there. And then it's like stepping up, trying at the fertile edge of doing it differently. Having your son that is like, no way, I'm going to stand for what's true. Yeah, it is fascinating. Again, maybe there are more women who are people pleasers. I'm not sure whether that goes both ways or not, but I think it's a very common woman-mother dynamic to put other people's needs and emotions first. And then it's interesting. You're going to have to report back when your son is older because then at some point it's also like your children where they have an idea of who you are, what they need. And then suddenly there's a reshifting, now that my children are a little bit older, it's like, well, I don't want to play that role anymore. I want to continue to expand as a human being and a mother. And, it's even at some point having that same relationship with your children and I always look at it like the more I do it, the more I free them to continue to do it in their lives. Like,
yes.
When we all give each other the freedom to be exactly who we are, isn't that more what unconditioned love is?
Yeah. That is so true and so beautiful. And already, even him being so young, I've felt into that. This idea of, right, if we continue this archetype of the martyr mother and we give up, say, like our dreams, our passions, our relationships, our whatever, in order to be a good mom, right? And we're sacrificing that and then, of course, resenting. But if we keep up that pattern, like we are teaching the next generation to do the same. Whereas even though it might feel uncomfortable, when you step out to care for yourself, to live your dream, right? To go after your goals or to you're showing them how to do that. You're showing them. And this is like really, again, tricky. It feels like this fertile ground of like in-betweenness where like, I know what I don't want to do. And I've never really seen it demonstrated what I do want to do. And so like, it's like no blueprint.
I say that. That's so true. There's no blueprint. Actually, I was talking to someone the other day who she's a scholar and she does a lot of goddess studies and Mary Magdalene gospel. And I was like, she was talking about how Mary Magdalene in some ways, well, in her studies was kind of the last archetype. And I'm like, are we almost creating a new archetype? I'm not really sure because it seems like women are, as what you just said, it's like, I don't know that many women that are creating the thing that I'm like, that's the thing. And I think it's been cultural conditioning. I think it's whether it's the glass ceilings, I think we're still living in a very patriarchally or masculine dominated society. The feminine hasn't quite balanced out here yet. So I'm like, it was so interesting as your generation continues to expand, almost like a rubber band, those edges that we were just talking about, those fertile edges, you're opening up that space for all women and mothers to claim what is true for them and move away from the martyr mother, move away from the devouring mother because there's a difference between this is what I want in my life when it comes from the shadow.
Right.
Versus this is who I feel I was born to be, and this is my path. And that's totally different. So as you said, there's that edge, but sometimes I think that edge is like, am I following, and sometimes it's still confusion, am I following this because it's a need that's unmet, or am I following this because this is my true birthright? And that, I think, is a process as women, as human beings.
Yeah. I think it's true what you said, like, it's a collective conversation, right? Like, we haven't seen exactly where we want to go because we're all on this fertile edge. Like, this is the frontier. And even this conversation of like psychedelics too, like we are all of us standing on the precipice of evolution. Of evolution. We are standing in the misty frontier land between what everybody knows.
We really are.
And what's next. And so I think it's really scary, challenging, beautiful, and easy to say, like, we're screwed, we have no role models. But I also think it's awesome because it connects us. Like, even when I work with my clients, like, the themes that run through the collective, like, we are all in this together. And that alone just makes us feel safer. Like we can have these conversations with other women that are doing the same thing, and we can support one another as we make these challenging decisions, as we shift from fear to love and start wondering, what does that look like? And we can do it together. Like we don't have to do it alone.
Together.
And I think, you know, at the end of the day, psychedelics would teach us, like, there's nobody else out there anyway. So it's like, we are all one. And it is all happening together.
Well, it's interesting what you were just speaking of. I had a teacher that used to tell me when I was kind of in the really darkest of places going through that shadow work, you know, you're in the liminal place. You don't yet know who you're going to be. It's like a caterpillar, you know, going into the cocoon. We don't know what's going to emerge yet. But I think, as you said, it's the same as motherhood. We don't know. It's the same as being birthed. Who were we before we were even born? And then earth medicine space, you go in and you have no idea what's going to be revealed. And birth, the same. You don't even know who your child's going to be.
Totally.
Which is so fascinating.
I was just going to tell you, and I just appreciate that every time we talk about like death, you bring in the word birth, and just recognizing how those are always one and the same. That like you just said, like it's that fertile womb space that we're in, and we think it's the end of everything. And when we get to that point where we finally surrender, and like that's, imagine, you know, like tying it back to birth, but like going through the birth canal, like the squeezing, the tightness, the end of everything you've ever known, I'm sure feels like death. And it is also the beginning of life. And there's no other way except to experience what we think is our death in order to be born as the newest version of ourselves, to be able to then do what it is we were born to do.
So beautiful. And it's interesting, I think every time we're about to take another leap in our own kind of spiritual, whatever you want to call it, like evolutionary process of getting closer to the reduction of fear and closer to love, it's like being in a washing machine. I was thinking, like, all of a sudden, you know, you can have these like incredible non-dual experiences and moments, and then suddenly you're like, wait, what just happened? I'm on spin cycle here.
Totally. And I think the more that happens, you start to trust it, and you start to recognize when I'm suffering the most, when I'm like really reeling in those cycles, something big's about to shift. Trust. It's coming. You know, nothing is forever. Everything is temporary. Easy to say when you're not in that cycle.
So beautiful. In the moment. I think one of the things I'm noticing is the more I can let go of the mind in it and just feel the sensations that are there, you know, after doing some of the deeper healing of story, but sometimes in just holding the sensation, in the awareness that it's just there, and not attaching all the story, because I do think the story is where all the fear lives.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think that's really like the key to all of it. Because, I mean, that's, you know, what like Buddhist meditation teaches. Like there's no aversion and there's no desire, and there's simply just is, and everything comes and everything goes. And if we can not assign any need for or desire away from, it passes. And we just become, like yoga would call it, the silent observer or the impartial witness. We just, you said sitting behind yourself, you know, we are that neutral consciousness. Ram Dass says, I am loving awareness. Like we are just the awareness watching it all, including who we think we are.
Looking through.
And that way we can like not suffer so much when these pieces of ourselves, these ego pieces that inevitably will die, go, because it only hurts if we identify ourselves with them versus just seeing it as another piece that's going to shed. That's not really who we are anyway.
No, and I think one of the biggest things that you're hinting on is it's like almost at your core. It's like, do you believe you are in a neutral world, a generous world? Because if in some ways, if you can, in my own experience, if I can see, and I think it's hard in the midst of something hard, that life is always moving in your best benefit, even if it's the hardest thing you're going through, that life itself is moving in your favor.
Always. For you, not to you. And I
for
think,
you,
again, like
not to
it's
you.
hindsight, right? How many people, maybe you're one of them, I certainly am, but how many people do you know that will look back at their life and say, that challenge was the best thing that ever happened to me, right? I wouldn't be who I am today if I hadn't gone through that pain. And it's like, why do
Exactly.
we forget
Yeah.
that when pain comes again?
Because we don't like pain. Yeah. What's it like for you as a mother when your child is suffering?
So this is actually beautiful. I try my best. Obviously, I have emotional attachment here, which makes it a little trickier of a dance, but to treat my child as if, just like I would with someone in a psychedelic experience, where we live in a culture that tells us pain is bad, that if my child is crying, I need to do something to fix it right away, that the emotion that he's experiencing is bad. And if I hurry to fix it, solve it, change it, distract him from it, I'm actually teaching him that his emotions are big and scary and bad and we need to be avoided, which then blossoms into all the beautiful disasters that we have become as adults, right?
Maladaptive
So
behaviors.
just like I would with someone going through a ceremony, like letting them have their experience, letting big emotions come through and not being afraid of them, just knowing that having big emotions is a part of being human and that we don't need to judge ourselves for them or change them, but like we can handle big sadness. We can handle anger productively. You know, it's not bad that we're having it. So I think for me, and again, this is the edge of everything I know, and I'm trying my best to learn it every day.
I think
But
this is the edge. And I
yeah,
think it is like the critical
yeah,
edge. It's
like
beautiful.
teaching our next generation that they don't need to be afraid of their own emotionality, that they are loved in all of themselves, in the full expression. So even in anger, even in sadness, even in rage, even in fear, and yes, of course, in joy and peace and harmony and all of that too, but like that they don't have to be only one version of themselves, that their whole self is
Right.
loved and welcome. And imagine if we like all believe that about ourselves, that every single part of
Right.
ourselves,
The full
was
spectrum
welcome and okay,
is
and we're
welcome.
broken. That this ambiguity, this paradox, this multidimensionality that we all are is being human. It's not bad or wrong, and we don't have to run from certain aspects of our existence.
No, this is the key. I love
Yeah,
it. You know, even the fact that this is in consciousness
right.
now, being spoke about, being shared, being truly felt from the place of motherhood, where it's like, this is the new kind of next generation that we want to raise, is children that can enjoy the full spectrum of themselves, not exile parts that then
Yes.
have to be dug
Yeah.
up later, like that we can allow those parts. Yeah. So, well, this has been such a nice
Yeah, for
conversation,
sure, for sure. I appreciate you so much.
really important
Yeah.
conversation.
And I always remind
So,
myself of
how can
that
people?
when I do get tough on myself, like if I'm not doing enough, and then just remembering like having these conversations alone is changing the world.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, I had something come up even this morning where I was like, how could I still be confused on this? How do I not have this answer yet? You know? And it's so interesting to then just be like, sit behind yourself. Let the question be what it is. And having these conversations is change.
Yeah.
Putting this message out in the world is change. Supporting other mothers that are listening to this is change. You know, even the message where we've had the experience where you're noticing, you know, a listener's noticing where, oh, it really bothers them when their child's angry or expresses these emotions, just being invited to consider a different way.
And to give
Yeah.
ourselves that
So
grace
how can
too.
people find you? We can't give it to others unless we first give it to
Yeah, and
ourselves,
that's
right?
it too. Like when those parts come up, like because we're afraid of
That's
our own
it.
anger, so deal with that, allow that, and then you can hold space for your
Right.
child's.
Right?
Oh, this conversation could go on forever. Let me address your question.
Right.
So I can be found multiple ways. I have a website. It is J, like Jen, my first name, Whaley, my last name, wellness.com. And on there you can find phone, email, and Instagram is a great way to find me. It's at J Whaley Wellness. And yeah, you can send messages, you can reach out. Happy to, continue the conversation, support people in any way. Yeah, that's probably the best way.
Great. And on that site there's information about the new kind of ketamine offering that you're doing?
There's a link on that site to a different website. So the ketamine is called Lucidelics. It's and I'll just really briefly, it's a combination of psychedelic therapy with ketamine combined with, and the clinical psychologist that I'm working with is named Michael Lukens, who works with something called the physics of emotioning. And we talk about like the therapy of emotional completions. So we're combining these two things in a really unique way and getting really beautiful results working with ketamine as a medicine. It's in Florida currently right now. Hopefully we'll be expanding. It's in person and or partially online as well. So lots of different options and will continue to be evolving. But if you go to my site, there's a link on my psychedelic page that'll go to lucidelics.com. And that's all brand new on the horizon. So if you have questions, reach out.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Thank
Thank
you
you.
so much.
Thanks for this opportunity and thanks for doing what you do.